Shakespeare must have thought of me when he wrote this. It's me. Have I not eyes? Have I not hands, organs, senses, dimensions, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases. If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die?
It moved them to tears.
Instead, I have to carry a spear.
Welcome to Season 5 of How Would Lubitsch Do It, a podcast in which we discuss the works of director Ernst Lubitsch, one film at a time. It's 1942, and Dara and Gary Jaffe join us to discuss To Be or Not to Be. Come visit ernstcast.com if you'd like show notes, resources as to where you might find the films we'll be discussing, a link to our Discord, or just to say hi. Hello, everyone. In person, mostly, we're here with Dara Jaffe and Gary Jaffe. We're back here in Season 5, of all things, to talk about Ernst Lubitsch's To Be or Not to Be. This will be the first of 2 episodes in which we discuss this film. And so, welcome, everyone, listeners and guests alike. Dara, you're rejoining us, and Gary, you're new to the show. Dara, you could reintroduce yourself to all the new listeners we will undoubtedly have now that we're covering popular movies.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me back to the show. I'm Dara Jaffe. I am a film historian and curator at the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures in Los Angeles, and very excited to talk To Be or Not to Be. It's one of my favorite movies of all time.
Well, thank you so much. And Gary?
Hi, I'm Gary Jaffe. As you probably inferred, I am Dara's little brother. And so I suspect that this is your first time having siblings guest star on your podcast. I'm a writer and director for mostly film, but I do have a theater background. And I'm so excited to be talking about the best movie ever to put together film and theater and fighting Nazis. So it's my pleasure to be here, Devin. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. And again, thanks to both of you for donating your time to the show. I'll introduce this question by starting with kind of my own take on it. We're in the point in this run through of Lubitsch's filmography where we're in the midst of films that really mean a lot to us. So I'd love to hear from both of you about To Be or Not to Be, what hit you about it the first time you saw it? What does it mean to you as a film, just holistically? Because to me, this film is why this show exists. I remember so well seeing actually the Grand Budapest Hotel in 2014. And Wes, in some interview, mentioned To Be or Not to Be and Lubitsch in general. And then a film critic who's been on the show many times, Tim Brayton, in his review of it, also mentioned To Be or Not to Be. And my friend Willa, who has also been on the show, mentioned that film. And I should probably watch this To Be or Not to Be film. And so I did. And immediately, it's one of those 3 or 4 times in my life where I watch a film and I go, immediately upon finishing it, I've just seen one of the greatest films I'm ever going to see in my life. It just completely blew me away. And I won't go too far into what about it blew me away, because I think that's what we're going to talk about for the next hour. But immediately, just the complete lack of inhibition in this movie, the intelligence with which it deals with the politics, the very specific politics with which it deals with, the humanism in the film, it made me truly emotional. And also it happens to be terrifically funny. Do one of you want to tell me about your experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is a film that demonstrates just exactly what film can do. And I think that is almost boundless. We have a director who is absolutely at the top of his game, showing things that you might think would be impossible until you actually watch it. The source of his humor being something you would never think could possibly be funny, and yet it's hilarious, that he still manages to hit really serious notes while keeping it. I think this movie goes down like champagne, as most of Lubitsch films do. Demonstrating how much you can vary in tone, in audience experience, the masterful manipulation of audience experience. And of course, when I talk about a director manipulating an audience experience, to me, that is what cinema is. And so that's the highest compliment. It's also the subject matter is very, personally important. My brother and I are Jewish. Our great aunt, who's still with us, is a Holocaust survivor. So the fact that this movie just puts every ingredient together, heart, comedy, absolutely smashing expectations of what you think is possible for a viewing experience. There's nothing else like it, except for the things that have tried to copy it. It's one of a kind, and it's the utmost of what cinema should be, as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you've mentioned our great aunt, Maritza. I'll talk about her a little bit once I talk about how I came to Be or Not to Be, which is as a student of the Dara Jaffe School of Cinema. I watch everything she tells me to. And she had told me to watch Lubitsch, and in particular to watch To Be or Not to Be. So I turned it on, not really knowing anything about what the movie was about. And then when I found out what the movie was about, as I was watching it, I could not believe that it existed. I could not believe that these images and these words were committed to celluloid in 1942 by a Jewish director in this fierce, funny, ferocious, charming, and as you've pointed out, Devin, so human way. When I finished it, I was gobsmacked. And what I love so much about it, as someone for whom my first love was theater and my artistic husband is cinema, I loved how the theater was the thing upon which the whole play turned. And every single way in which this wily Polish theater troupe defies the literal Nazis, up to and including Hitler, is the tools of theatrical comedy going back to Shakespeare, going back to ancient times. And if you think that that's unrealistic, which there is a certain suspension of disbelief here, I'll bring it back to our great aunt Maritza, who, after she and her mother literally escaped a line that was going to take them to the train, to take them to a concentration camp, they, being blonde, theatrically convinced some Nazis to drive them back to Budapest in Hungary. So the whole, oh, what do you mean? We just don't have our papers. This improvisation scene saved my great aunt's life. She's still with us. And it was all because of theatrical games of who am I versus who am I pretending to be, which is the core essence of To Be or Not to Be. Throw in an artificial beard or a gown or a costume. If you think this movie isn't real, I give you my great aunt Maritza.
Wow, I can't believe I haven't put it together until you said that they actually had to do a lot of improvisation after they ran away from that line, because even before they came upon those Nazi soldiers and they were asked point blank, are you Jewish? Her mother said, look at my daughters, they're blonde. Have you ever seen a blonde Jew? So that was one of many trials. Another one was when they came to the nearest town. The first people they came upon, basically her mother thought, if we try to hide, it'll be really conspicuous. So we need to just go right up to someone and ask. So she said, hello, I'm looking for the blank residence. And she said just a very common Hungarian last name. And they said, oh yeah, their house is right there. Thank you. They go to the house. There's just a young girl there and they say, we're friends of your parents. They're not expecting us, but can we wait until they come home? And while they're staying at this complete stranger's house, the little girl is bragging about how she just turned in some Jews like 2 days before. And it was basically one improvisation after another to get them back to Budapest, where they were in hiding until they were liberated by the Russians. But wow, I had not put it together that they were literally playing a scene, just like in this movie.
It's wonderful that this is becoming so much about Maritza, because literally Dara and I talked about some things before this podcast, but this never came up. This is just really inspiration from Dara's contribution just there. But the way that Maritza talks about that time also emphasizes the sheer banality of the Nazis and their occupation of Budapest, which I think is a very Lubitchian thing here, that the Nazis are not these evil monsters, though their ideals are monstrous and their practices are. They're these kind of clownish fools that have the very too human aspects. But Maritza would tell me a story about how she had a bicycle when she was 13 and she liked it. And then the Nazis took away her bicycle. Like, that's just the sort of banal human aspect that comes with fascism. And I think that there's a real connection there.
Yeah, when she talks about it, she's like, I really liked that bicycle. Like, it's just, as you said, it's so banal, yet just one stand-in for a much larger thing that happened to her and to so many people. But we can bring it back to Be or Not to Be.
I'm just at a loss as to where to branch off from this, because I have like 5 different things I want to talk about that your story has provoked in me. So this is incredible. I think the one I want to pull on for this point is this humanism, this way that Lubitsch refuses to portray anyone as a monster. There's this line from Professor Seletsky in To Be or Not to Be, where he asks,
Now tell me, do I look like a monster?
Oh, of course not, Professor.
You say that as though you really meant it.
I do.
We're just like other people. We love to sing, we love to dance. We admire beautiful women. We're human. And sometimes very human.
I was actually listening to the David Kalat commentary from the Criterion box set, which is probably my favorite commentary in history, although that's tied with a couple of other of his own commentaries. But he speaks of Lubitsch's treatment of the Nazis in this film as not monsters, but people who do monstrous things. And this isn't meant as a sort of apologia for them, but as an idea that he refuses to separate the non-Nazis from the Nazis in the film as us and them. We all have the capability to do evil. And then one of the most terrifying things about this film is that it refuses to let us go easily from that implication. And so you have the protagonists in this film using not strength of weapons, but their own understanding of their enemy. In this case, your great aunt escaped, it seems, in one of the parallels we can draw here is because she understood and her family understood the logic of the people they were trying to escape from. And the reverse was not true. If they had known the idea of, in this case, a blonde Jewish person, it's not unusual. Their own ignorance and their own refusal to see what they saw as their enemies. Humanity that, in that case, let your aunt survive, which is incredible. And the same thing occurs in this, where it's, in this case, Joseph Tura, who is a fool in this movie, yet he understands. He's not so much of a fool that he doesn't know the value of understanding his adversary. It's his own understanding that gets him out of all these situations.
Which is why, for me, the moment in watching the film where I guffawed the largest is when Colonel Earhart says exactly the same words that Joseph Tura, in his, we think, bad performance as Colonel Earhart.
So they call me Concentration Camp Earhart.
And then when Sig Ruman says the same exact things because he's a fool.
Oh,
he's
they
even
do,
more
do they?
Colonel, you're quite famous in London. You know what they call you? Concentration Camp Earhart.
Oh, they do they? So they call me Concentration Camp Earhart.
I thought you would react.
I thought you'd react that way.
Yeah.
Because humans are fundamentally foolish, especially when they're Nazis. And the fact that Joseph Tura is able to have so much success with them and his wife Maria even more success with them because they understand that profound foolishness that must accompany this foolish but exceedingly dangerous ideology. What a sword to fight the Nazis with, to say, you think you're so tough, but I see you. You are fools. You are clowns.
I think another parallel here that can bring us back to the heart of the film is they know what the expectations these people hold. They know what those expectations are. So they can literally perform to those expectations and then undercut that as they see fit. So they know if I'm going to pretend to be a Nazi or if I'm going to pretend to be a woman who might be open to being swayed to being a Nazi spy, I'm going to play it exactly as they expect it, which is exactly what our great aunt's mother did when she said, a blonde Jew? Impossible. So they can perform to those expectations and then when it serves them, refuse to execute those expectations. And that is exactly what Lubitsch is doing as a director. He knows you come into the movie theater with specific expectations, and he might trick you into thinking that he's going to perform to meet those. And then when you least expect it, he pulls the rug out from under your feet. Gary, I saw at one point you put your hand up.
When you were talking about Maria Tora executing expectations, I couldn't help but enact the Heil Hitler after being kissed by Seletsky. So what you saw was my imitating Carol Lombard in that moment. It was
I saw. Wow.
Yeah.
No, but that's so true because like in what universe does a kiss from that man, oh, I'm suddenly a Nazi now, and yet that's what they seemingly expect. That's what she performs.
And it's so funny because he says before then, by the end of the night, I'll have you sing Heil Hitler. And then she goes, puts on the gown, which was her foolish concentration camp gown, designed by Irene. I think the dressmaker's name is. I also listened to the commentary from the Criterion channel, which was annoying because several points that I wanted to make were made by him. I was like, no, it's not as original stuff.
We're under the really unfortunate circumstance of like, I'm fully aware there's no way that anything I can produce can hold a candle to David Kalat's commentary. There is one little element here that I do love where Lubitsch, he's very clever about letting you in on the mechanics of all this too, where it's not just like these abstract thematic concerns such as this idea of understanding your enemy that we have to kind of infer. We see it in the film. I mean, I think the closest anyone in this film has to a character arc. And this film is notably without character arcs, essentially. No one ends this film any better of a person than when they started. And that's part of the thematic payload, which is fun. But one thing I do love is this whole idea that seems quite abstract of understanding your adversary and empathizing and how that ties into humanism, but also into, in this case, a sort of victory, is that when Joseph Tura has to imitate Earhart, having never met the man, it's a disaster. It ends up with him being held at gunpoint and Seletsky gets shot and he's found out after about 5 minutes. But after having met and, gotten a read on Seletsky, his impression to Earhart is not only clearly more accurate. Every time I watch the film, I almost mistake him for Seletsky when we first see him dressed up. He embodies him so well, but it's much more effective. I mean, the only thing that gets him found out is the plot machinations outside of his own control, right? He carries it off wonderfully, despite the fact that that would require Tura to affect, what does Kalat say? Flawless, uninflected German.
Right.
Which is obviously not that believable, except we're all Americans speaking English. But point being, I do love that Lubitsch really makes these thematic concerns concrete in how the story is written and how the plot unfolds. And it's so cleverly designed to allow us a way into that without having to dissect it later on as academics.
That plot point exactly underscores how so much of the film, which is appropriate for a man of the theater like Ernst Lubitsch, relies on how well the actors can play the scene. Can they play the scene? That's literally dialogue that Joseph Tura asks Maria, do you think I can do it? And she says, you're the best actor. I think earlier she says, which of course you can. And then scene after scene after scene is, can they execute the theatrical point successfully? Can they convince the audience? Will the hair and makeup stand? If they have to improvise, can they improvise successfully? And will they buy it? And what do we as filmmakers, as theater writers, as whatever, what are we always concerned with? Will they buy it? And every moment here, that's the question, except the they is often literal Nazis.
Whenever there's any kind of little blurb on this film, there's always mention that it's about theatricality. So what does the film say about it? How does theatricality play into, in this case, if we want to understate things, a critique of authoritarianism, of Nazism? What moral line can we draw between the theatricality we see here and anti-fascism in this case?
So my answer to that question is going to be on a slightly different angle. I want to look at it as in support of anti-fascism. Because when you look at this theatrical troupe, who are our heroes, and how they use theatricality to defy and literally fight and kill Nazis, it summons the power of the theater and the power of this artifice to have real consequences. Take, for example, one of the most stunning sequences in the movie when Professor Seletsky flees into the theater, is chased by the troupe, and then the spotlight becomes a searchlight to sweep over the audience looking for Seletsky. He is seen on the stage, disappears behind the curtain. Sabinsky, the handsome lieutenant, disappears after him. There are gunshots. And then, like Polonius's death in Hamlet, a murder behind the curtain. Who was it? The curtain rises. And in perfect tableau, like staged, you see Sabinsky with the gun and Seletsky dead. And there's real consequence to the profoundly effective work of these theater makers. So for me, and of course I have this profound love of theater, this is Lubitsch saying to me, yes, the theater is fake, but look what we can do. Look what this theater troupe, which could be a troupe of soldiers, or there's another double there, the theater of war, however many like English language doubles you want to think for a German-speaking film director. It's there, the real power. And that extends to the whole movie, that the Nazis are thwarted by a foolish troupe of actors and directors and writers and makeup artists, but maybe they're not so foolish after all.
I love how the tools of theater, like that spotlight, become their weapons, their defense. I also think there is a lot of theater that goes into a party like the Nazis coming into the power that they came into. I mean, think about Triumph of the Will, so powerfully staged that Lucas recreated it for Star Wars. It takes a lot of theater. It takes a lot of manipulation of public perception to get that kind of emotional power over a people, especially in a vulnerable moment like this was. So when I think about theater, and I'm definitely going to be throwing it back to Gary for more of the substance of the theater itself, but for me, I can't help but approach in terms of film form, what's the structure that's being created for the viewer. So to me, and actually our entire lives before Gary crossed over to film, we had this epic ongoing battle of film versus theater in our family. And one thing I always said is that, film has the power to hide its artifice or to bring it out to serve whatever viewing experience the director wants. But theater, the stage is always in front of you. I think Bazan said something about how when you're sitting in the theater, you can't possibly imagine yourself in the role of the character because there's an actual person right in front of you, and you understand that they're the ones experiencing this, not me. That artifice is always there. Film could disappear that if you want, but Lubitsch doesn't want to. Right from the beginning of this movie, he makes the viewer aware that they are still a viewer. They're sitting in their movie seat. They're watching a movie. And one of the primary ways he keeps this through line going is that the film revolves around theater. So this idea of an artificial presentation is always inherent in the substance of the film. And, lots of movies do this, with the making of a film within the film. But I think it's very particular that Lubitsch chooses theater, this live presentation, which actually in this case, I'm realizing for the characters, the artifice of theater is removed because they're performing for their lives. Like the theater is in real life. They're in front of these Nazis. As Gary was saying, if they don't buy it, they're dead. I'd love to come back to how he establishes the world at the beginning of the film. And I think I might have even talked about this a little bit in our last podcast. The beginning of a film is so crucial to how the viewer understands the rules of this cinematic universe. For instance, if your film is a musical, you should establish that early on. Because if you wait till like an hour in and then suddenly people start singing out of nowhere and they all know all the words and moves, the viewer's going to be like, no, wait a second. This wasn't the contract we had. I can't accept this now. So for a movie like this, Lubitsch needs to let you know the rules of the film very early on, even if it is to throw the rule book out the window. And the very first thing he does in this movie is make you aware of some level of artifice. First of all, there is voice of God narration. Narration, to me, is always a tool that, highlights the artifice because it's calling attention to the fact that you are there to receive information directly to you, kind of punctures the cinematic universe in a way. But also, you're watching Hitler walk down the street. There's just simply no way this could be possible. Now, in this case, so I was going to say that if the very first thing that a director does is point out to you that you've been fooled in some way, like this wasn't what you thought. This was a theatrical performance. First of all, you're aware of the hand of the director. You're aware that you can be fooled. You're aware that this universe might not be what it seems. We talked about margins of safety last time. Already, the margins of safety are a little loose, a little in play. But also Lubitsch, he does credit his viewer with a lot of intelligence. So he knows there's a catch. There's no way Hitler's just walking down the street and this is, for real. But you're waiting for that punchline. You're waiting for the reveal of what is going on. And so you're aware that there's some intellectual interplay here between you and the film in trying to figure out what exactly its rules are. And so then when you find out that the mechanism for why you're seeing Hitler walk down the street is theater, it immediately tells you that is the definition for this structure of artifice.
And as a part of that, how about those 3 signs of Polish names? What the shop around the corner, Hungary moved to Poland, and here we are on a set with some artificial sense of foreignness. And then you're talking about when does the real punchline happen? Well, the real punchline happens when we burn them down about 15 minutes later. And that sense of security that you came from walking onto the shop around the corner set becomes something that you are not feeling very safe in because, behind one of them, literally something is toppling over. And then there's sort of a joke where the 2 Anskys, Ansky and Ansky, and one of them's still up and the other one is on the ground. And then, of course, you see marching Nazis. And so that whole sense of safety that's built into that artifice is now painfully real for 1942.
Right. The real Nazis are here now. It's not a fake Hitler walking down the street anymore.
Exactly. Like, oh, you just saw Hitler walking in the streets of Warsaw. How odd. Oh, no. Now this is not a joke.
This gets at the margins of safety that you introduced back in our Shoe Palace Pincus episode, which if anyone listening here hasn't heard that episode, pause now, go to that episode, and then come back to us now, because it's incredibly relevant here. This idea of margin of safety as a kind of buffer between the audience and the reality of the situation. This film has a very complex relationship to that, where you have, just as you both said, you have this, what seems like a margin of safety, these goofy foreign names, and we're in, despite the fact that it's a different studio, different crew, the opening shot looks just like one of the establishers from Shop Around the Corner. It's functionally identical. But the Nazis invade the town from Shop Around the Corner, basically, which is not just Hungary, but it's small town America. It really feels like it's hitting home. So you have this margin of safety, this to a 1940 American, what might seem like a quaint foreign nation, being totally obliterated. That feels like a violation, doesn't it? Oh, wow. Lubitsch said, I'm going to paraphrase here because I've forsaken my notes.
I have the full quote right here if you want it.
Yeah, and then I'll use the magic of editing to make it seem like you came up with it first.
No, it should be yours. Here's the quote. I was tired of the two established recognized recipes, drama with comedy relief and comedy with dramatic relief. I had made up my mind to make a picture with no attempt to relieve anybody from anything at any time. Dramatic when the situation demands it, satire and comedy whenever it is called for. One might call it a tragical farce or a farcical tragedy. I do not care, and neither do the audiences. Of course, just imagine all of that with Lubitsch's very thick accent.
This might seem sacrilegious, but I almost disagree with what he has actually accomplished here, because I think you do get not the deep relief of, oh, everything's okay, but you get relief moments on a purely visceral level where you are allowed to laugh, and the tension of the actual very real emotions and fears, I think, is what allows for those to be even stronger. I was taught that one reason Hitchcock always uses macabre humor is because if your tension level is very high, as with, a suspenseful, scary moment, that emotion is just like right on the top of your chest. It needs to come out. And if you allow that to come out in humor, you get a bigger laugh. So paradoxically, this pairing of this extreme, very real fear does equal bigger laugh moments if you're someone like Lubitsch or Hitchcock who can play that correctly to allow that dynamic to have that effect. And I think you definitely have that here. There's so many big laugh moments. As I said, it's almost shallow relief. It's not real relief, but I think viscerally it's working on a level of relief.
Something I was thinking about on that is the transformation from thriller to sex comedy that happens after Sabinski is hiding in Maria Tora's apartment and the Nazis are there and Maria Tora successfully gets rid of them, or rather they're coming to look for her. So the young handsome lieutenant will not be discovered this time. And then in comes Joseph and we wildly swing out of thriller into sex comedy. And that scene is incredibly funny, and it keeps building up that tension up until he goes into To Be or Not to Be, and out comes Sabinski from the bed to march and sleepwalk, humiliating Joseph Tora once more. But it's really a fascinating, jump of tone, and it's all one sort of extended plot sequence.
I actually took down the time codes of the film where I sort of have eyeballed the genre shifts, because at exactly 21 minutes, you have the dissolve, you have the store signs, right? And they're destroyed. And then there's basically not a single significant laugh of any note until that exact scene you're mentioning at 43 minutes in. So that's 22 minutes of the film that is essentially a pretty sobering wartime thriller. There are little Lubitsch moments where if you look at it askance, you can laugh. The little business in the bookshop or some of the ins and outs of the dialogue and with Robert Stack at RAF. But laughs desert the movie for 22 minutes. It does feel like a relief when they come back, but that relief almost has this, to me, two-sided effect, right? Where one, I'm permanently on the defensive for the rest of the movie. I'm never laughing in the way I did at Felix Broussard complaining about he's a spirit carrier. I'm laughing with this slight pain in the pit of my stomach, but at the same time, that makes it funnier. I think Willa made this point actually about Tony Erdmann, but it's one of the more profound points I've ever heard about comedy, where they said Tony Erdmann is all the funnier because it acknowledges the tragedy. It's often spoken about this intrinsic connection between comedy and horror, but I think comedy and tragedy are also, connected in that way, where to me, some of the hardest I've ever laughed in a film is, like the concentration camp Erhard line later, which is horrifying. I'm horrified that I'm laughing at that, but that makes it funnier because it's transgressive. So there is this way that the two create this feedback loop. And by the end, I'm always a wreck as much because the comedy as the tragedy.
Exactly. And some of the most potent emotional moments can come when you take the thing that previously has been the funniest and make that the moment where the tragedy is going to hit. And you mentioned as your example of something in the beginning that had you just full on laughing with no complications was the character of Greenberg, who begins as just pure comic relief. And of course, that is the character that ultimately I think has the realest stakes. And in the end, I think will hit you the hardest. And I think part of it is that transition from the comic relief to actually, this is as real as it gets. But I know we want to talk a lot about Greenberg. But one thing I just wanted to say before we get too much further on is that you mentioned, in coming into this town, yes, it's this very Lubitchian kind of stand-in small town for whatever European town you want it to be. You and I talked last time about how for his American viewers, his movies are set in this far-off place, maybe kind of exotified. You called it could be a small American town. And I think that's a really big question for this movie is how much are the American viewers supposed to think of it as, actually, this time, how far away are we from this plot? Normally he wants you to feel removed from it, but in this case, when the Nazi threat is truly against the whole world, is this little Polish town actually a little American town? And I think that line becomes very blurred by the fact that, of course, Carol Lombard will be killed when this movie comes out. And I think that makes it very, very real and very close to the American viewers.
Just to kind of clarify, Carol Lombard died in a plane accident, tragically, right before this movie was released. And that put a huge pall over everything. That's a great point. And the film sends you mixed messages, doesn't it? Right? Mm-hmm. Where we're not in Varsovia anymore. We're not in a fictional little Middle European country that you need a magnifying glass to see. We're in Poland right as it's being invaded, a historical event that everyone in the audience would be 100% familiar with, everyone over the age of 2. It's so hyper-specific, and yet we have entire plot contrivances that are only made possible because of the specific margins of safety that Lubitsch does use, like using American comedians, right? We know his aim in doing this is largely to make it relatable, to make it so Americans watching it can't say, oh, that's happening over there. I'm not implicated. This is some foreign thing happening. No, this is made real and familiar. So that sense of both specificity and familiarity almost feels calibrated to roil the audiences and to make you feel profoundly unsafe, all the while it's allowing you to laugh.
There's an interesting way of tying Greenberg into that very audience migration from a sense of foreignness to a sense of usness, because we see Greenberg throughout, and when we meet him, he's got that very thick accent, and there's not much of a he is us kind of way. And the first time he plays the Shylock monologue, we're not really identifying with it. But then the second time he plays it, it's after Warsaw has been destroyed, and it cuts right in on him and Vronsky shoveling snow.
If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? What a Shylock you would have been.
But the us, I think, there is doing a lot of work to bring the audience into Greenberg's experience as someone who has essentially lost his city, lost his home, and that we is including them too. Now, of course, this is very interesting because the we there is also Jews. And the word Jew doesn't get to appear in this movie. And the word Jew, which Shakespeare puts into Shylock's monologue.
I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands?
Is a conveniently edited for 1942, don't have an agenda, keep the Jews behind the camera, Hollywood. So that even in the grand finale, when Greenberg takes that joke, I mean, look, when Dobosh gives him the direction of the plan about how he's going to spring out in the middle of the Nazis.
Greenberg?
Yes, Mr. Dobosh.
If we can manage that Greenberg suddenly pops up among all those Nazis...
It'll get a terrific laugh.
No, it won't.
And speaking, Devin, as you were saying about taking the joke and making it profound, making it drama, that joke then becomes the most heroic moment in the film when Greenberg literally plays for his life and plays for the life of his friends, the Shylock monologue, surrounded by Nazis, but also his friends and Vronsky watching the performance and being so moved by it, just like he said he would.
Yeah, there's a real rule of 3 at work here. By the third time he does that monologue, and he's not only saying it to his aggressors, he's not only playing the role of his lifetime, he's not only up against these, like, just as I said before, very real stakes. Every emotion in my body is like at its max during the third time he does the monologue. And you're absolutely right that it's that every time he says it, the definition of it is slightly different. And I will say that even though they don't explicitly say that he's Jewish, I will say there's almost more hints than usual. I mean, not only his name, but also the fact that he says,
Mr. Ravitch, what you are, I wouldn't eat.
How dare you call me a ham?
To me, that almost is explicit.
That third Shylock monologue, when Felix Broussard delivers it in the climax in the theater at the end, what strikes me about that version of it is that if we were to take Greenberg as, in some ways, an avatar of Ernst Lubitsch, which I think is hopefully a valid reading, think of how many layers deep we are into the artifice at that point. We are, one, Shylock is playing a sort of revolutionary in that scene who is making trouble and trying to ostensibly assassinate someone. That's what Greenberg is playing. and you have Bronski playing Hitler. So you have a fake assassin talking to a fake Hitler. Not only that, but Bronski is being played by an actor. Greenberg is being played by actor Felix Broussard. And the entire scene is a charade by all parties simply to escape, right? The whole idea of assassinating Hitler is not on the table at any point in this, unlike in a certain semi-remake that would happen about 70 years later. And so this is about as deep as the movie gets down the rabbit hole of nested theatricality. Yet at the same time, the way that Greenberg, or more specifically Felix Broussard kind of delivering the things that Ernst Lubitsch wants him to deliver in the ways he wants him to deliver it, says that speech, which again was not written by anyone in the film. It was written by William Shakespeare hundreds of years earlier, straight to the camera, the exact same words he'd been delivering before. But in this context, the specific theatrical framework of this context allows those words to become incredibly sincere. I've seen The Merchant of Venice, I think, twice on stage, and I've never seen that speech delivered half as well as it is here, or to half as much effect.
How did you get here?
I was born here.
And what made you decide to die?
Him.
What do you want from the Fuhrer?
What does he want from us? What does he want from Poland? Why all this? Why? Why? Aren't we human? Have we not eyes? Have we not hands, organs, senses, dimensions, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, cooled and warmed by the same winter and summer? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? If you wrong us, shall we not revenge?
And I think it's because of the careful contextualization that allows those words to become this completely unironic plea for humanity. It's still specific. It's still about Greenberg's Jewishness, which is so heavily implied, it's practically overt, obviously informs it. So it's both specific to that and universal in a way that, I mean, to me, if there's a single scene in movie history that can get an emotional reaction on me, it's that one. Every time I even talk about it, I used to teach this film in class. I would have a hard time getting through discussions of the scene because I'd be so overcome by the emotion of it. It's terrific.
The way you just laid that out kind of like opened something for me, because you're talking about all these layers of artifice, layers of meta, all of these layers. And in the end, actually what all of these layers do is equal 0 layers. It is direct. If Greenberg / Felix is the stand-in for Lubitsch, then actually it's Lubitsch just talking straight to you. If Lubitsch is representing the very real Jewish emotion and the threat to Jews in this moment, then it becomes very real, like, this is about Jews. This message is being delivered directly. There are no layers between you and Lubitsch here. And also, there are no layers because, as you just said, this monologue is performed so well. Even that on its own, every layer disappears. You are receiving this very emotional performance. Like, it's a direct hit. Like, anything else would fall away just in how powerful this monologue is performed. So all of these layers actually equals 0 layers. It's as direct as it gets.
I think that's so brilliant, Dara. And if we want to unpack some of those layers that amount to 0 layers just a little bit more, I think there's 2 important things to really talk about with this moment and Shakespeare in general. The first is pretty brief, which is that we begin by seeing Bronski and Greenberg as spear carriers. And they literally talk about, all I get to do is carry a spear. For those who don't know, Shakespeare often begins his plays with small characters who sort of bring us into the world so that he can then introduce the main characters, whether that's the street denizens in Romeo and Juliet or the watchmen in Hamlet. And this is no different. But that is a joke in theater. All I get to do is carry a spear. But of course, that becomes the really beautiful line when Greenberg asks Bronski,
I wonder if we'll ever carry a spear again.
But then by the end of this movie, when the whole thing counts on the heroism of the spear carriers, I think that speaks to Lubitsch's real sense for an egalitarian communal effort that is the theater. Of course, there's that joke at the end when Tura says,
Thank you, my friends, for everything you did. As little as it may have been.
But you can go through the movie and go from Dobosh to Ravitch the Ham to the makeup artist who supplies the second beard. The makeup artist is in two moments. He's in the very beginning when they're discussing Bronski and whether he actually looks like Hitler. He's then in the underground hideout talking about supplying Tura with an extra beard, which of course becomes Tura's method of survival when he is caught in that very funny and very dangerous scene where he's in the living room with the dead Seletsky.
Edmondson's London.
The real Seletsky came from London. The suit was bought in London.
You think it looks bad for me?
Terrible.
His watch is still running, which means he was killed since the real Professor Seletsky arrived in war. This really looks bad for me. You know I'm liable to get shot?
There's a distinct possibility.
Anyway, so that's the glory to the spear carriers, I think is a real profound part of that moment. But then, to talk about the Shylock monologue a little bit more, I think it's important to remember that Shylock is a villain and was written originally by William Shakespeare to capitalize on Elizabethan attitude toward Jews who they didn't really know, since Jews had been expelled from England several centuries prior, but had some really nasty attitudes about. So nasty, in fact, that Christopher Marlowe had this very successful play called The Jew of Malta, in which the evil mustache-twirling Jew, Barabbas, literally ends the play boiling alive in a cauldron, cursing the Christians for having, defied his own attempt to get them to fall into the boiling cauldron. Basically, they take away his money, he's annoyed, he goes on a killing spree, he gets punished for it. The audience applauds and begs for more. Shakespeare, as we know, is a famous thief, so he sees, okay, yeah, I can deliver more than that. And he writes The Merchant of Venice, which is a 5-act comedy, which was very successful at its time, featuring the villain Shylock, who Shakespeare couldn't help but write a little bit too human. He gives Shylock a really, really good reason to be bitter at the Christians who surround him.
So, sir, you spit on me on Wednesday last. You spurned me such a day. Another time you called me dog.
Oh, we're doing The Merchant of Venice.
And then he's really pushed around by people in the play. He loses so much, and he demands something unreasonable.
A pound of flesh to be by him cut off nearest the merchant's heart.
And then by the end of Act 4, not Act 5, Act 4, his plot is fixed by a twisty bit of legalese. Yes, you can have your pound of flesh, but if you spill one drop of Christian blood, we'll throw you in jail, for murder. And so he loses everything. And then they say, as punishment, by the way, you now have to convert to Christianity. His final lines are, I am content, and is shoved off the stage so that Act 5 can have a nice, charming rom-com ending involving a weird little plot about what's in which box. Not making that up. And Merchant of Venice is very popular for many, many, many years until in the 19th century, Edmund Kean starts to do Shylock in a more sympathetic way. And that changes the game on Shylock so much that nowadays, if you're going to go see Merchant of Venice, you're going to see a sympathetic Shylock. It's just the way of the game. But that's not the case in the 1940s. And what's very interesting is in the 30s and 40s, Hitler has Merchant of Venice in the repertoire. And every time he brings the Jewish Shylock out, he has people in the audience hissing and booing. And he plays Shylock for all the anti-Semitic stereotypes you can possibly imagine. And I think there's a moment in Vienna, when Vienna is supposedly Jew-free at that point, where when Shylock comes on stage, people scream, cry, vomit, basically. And that's contemporaneous with this moment. So here's Lubitsch taking what's already started to happen, starting with Edmund Kean, which is the sympathetic recontextualization of Shylock, and he makes it this heroic monologue, which is all a way of taking what was used to oppress us to empower us.
I just learned a lot.
Yeah, no kidding. How do you follow that?
I can speak a bit more to this idea that calling attention to the overt Jewishness is something that Hollywood would not want to do right now. And yet I think Lubitsch does it much more than most. This is a moment when Poles in America, and by that I mean Polls, I should differentiate because we are talking about Poles, Poles in this movie, but American public discourse, American public opinion is absolutely not in favor of getting involved in this war on the basis of helping Jews on a humanitarian level. We've already seen that every poll is in favor of not allowing more immigration there. And, this is a bit earlier, and this might be taking us down another path too much, but the Nazis' original plan was just to get the Jews out of Germany. The problem wasn't leaving. The problem was finding somewhere to go. And America very much closed its doors on potential refugees trying to escape. So concentration camps, genocide was actually plan B. So we already know that there's very dominant anti-Semitism in American culture at that moment. If you want to get people really riled up to fight this war, the last thing you want to do is make it seem like you're doing it to aid the Jews. There was a recent Ken Burns documentary called The U.S. and the Holocaust, and he talks about how even after America is in this war, they don't tell the soldiers that they're going in there to free Jews from concentration camps because they're worried they won't fight as hard if they think they're fighting for a Jewish cause. As we know, of course, Hollywood was incredibly involved in this propaganda war effort. And in this case, I say propaganda kind of in a good way because we do want to fight the Nazis. The last thing Hollywood wants to do is call attention to the Jewish plight. You could compare this to Casablanca, which is made the same year. Again, there's so much Jewish talent behind this movie. The executive producer, the director, all three credited screenwriters, several of the stars are all Jewish. In this movie, you literally have a main character escaping a concentration camp, and yet there is absolutely zero reference to Jews. There is zero reference to the fact that Jews are being targeted by Nazis, not even a coded hint, let alone what I think in comparison is explicit in To Be or Not to Be. So that kind of sets the scene for Lubitsch's approach here. To my knowledge, there's only one movie made during World War II that does call out the fact that it's Jews being targeted by the Nazis, and that's André de Toth's None Shall Escape. And I think that also makes for an interesting comparison to Be or Not to Be, because similarly, it is made by a European, in this case, a Hungarian, who has seen some of the effects of Nazis in Europe firsthand. And also it involves kind of a rewriting, although interestingly, To Be or Not to Be is looking back by a couple years and reimagining, like, what if this had happened? None Shall Escape is actually looking forward. It was made in 1944, but it's set after the war is over and you're seeing Nazis go on trial for war crimes. So it's actually like pre-imagining the Nuremberg trials. And that movie, André de Toth fought to have a scene where the Jews of the town are being rounded up and put on a train. And the rabbi of the town gives an incredibly stirring speech about how to be tolerated is the worst thing you can be, to be merely tolerated. So in light of the kind of backdrop here, I really truly think of Greenberg as explicitly Jewish by comparison. And I think that's something to keep in mind in terms of Lubitsch's chutzpah in this case.
Another good comparison is The Mortal Storm.
Mm-hmm.
It's set in Germany as the Nazis were essentially fully cracking down on any form of non-party society. There's one character in the film and kind of one family, but especially one professor character who is coded Jewish, but it's far more vague than Greenberg. That film essentially pitches the central sin of the Nazis as not ethnic bigotry and xenophobia. It pitches it as an ideological bigotry, and that's the extent of it. And that's kind of a great example of a thread among all these Hollywood films at the time where you watch Casablanca, you watch The Mortal Storm, there's a focus on they don't tolerate ideas. If you read any history book on the subject, it's kind of understood that the Nazis' central and Hitler's central project was not necessarily an ideological one. It was an ethnic one. The ideology was a function of xenophobia, basically. The Hollywood films would really, for those specific reasons for example, you had many Jews working throughout Hollywood who were very, very, you mentioned this in our previous episode, Dara, kind of canny about the idea that they didn't want to be seen as loyal to the Jewish people before they were loyal as Americans. There was a lot of self-censorship going on and, of course, some outside imposition, but all that led to this kind of deliberate vagueness. The Mortal Storm, I actually think it's a weakness in that film. It's not a weakness in To Be or Not to Be, I think, but it's a weakness in The Mortal Storm because I actually think that film misdiagnoses Nazism. It kind of, you watch it now and you go, okay, this isn't really, it's like the doctor, the pain's here, but it's actually my elbow. That's the sense I get in a lot of those films.
We shouldn't talk too much about Mel Brooks' remake of To Be or Not to Be.
I've still never seen it, so I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, Gary took one for the team.
I took one for the team.
Hello, new order to all those mothers in the fatherland. I said, baby, I got me a plan. I said, what you got, Adolf? What you gonna do? I said, how about this one? World War II.
It's actually very funny. If you go on HBO Max, or I guess what's called Max now, and you search To Be or Not to Be, it says it's the Mel Brooks version. And then when you start playing it, it's the Lubitsch, which I think is actually kind of great because it's like, oh, you thought you were going to watch that version? Watch the good one. You just want to watch the good one.
You want spam, you're getting steak.
That's funny because I tried to watch it on Max and I saw the cover and I was like, never mind, I'll go find it on the Criterion channel. So if I just clicked on it.
Yeah, if you just clicked it, just tried to watch the Mel Brooks, you'd have watched Lubitsch. So I watched it. I think it's really illustrative of why Lubitsch's version works and to look at why Brooks' version doesn't. Essentially, everything that Lubitsch does with his famous touch, with the effortlessness, the grace, and also the precision, Brooks does with the baseball bat, because that's his style. And Brooks's baseball bat is very effective in certain capacities, but I don't think it's really effective here. That said, there's one part that I think is worth talking about, especially in the conversation we're having, which is that he gets to name the Jews. And he doesn't make his character, who's sort of a fusion of Bronsky and Tura, into one character. He doesn't make his character Jewish, but he makes one of the people who works in the theater a Jewish woman. And throughout the movie, she starts hiding Jews in the basement. And then during the big show for Hitler and his cronies, they facilitate the escape of the Jews, sort of Sound of Music style, and in a clown car with everyone covered in clown makeup. And this brings us to the one moment that I think has some real beauty in it, which is that this woman who works in the theater and her husband are deathly terrified. They appear on stage and they get stage fright, which is they're scared to be on stage when they look out and they see that the audience is full of Nazis. Again, literal Nazis, as I like to point out. And they get stage fright, but it looks like it's just part of their clown act, so the people laugh. But then when they're brought out through the audience, they freeze because they're surrounded by Nazis. They can't move. And one of the other clowns thinks quickly, pulls out 2 yellow stars, pats them on their chests, and goes, "Ha ha, you did, ha 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 ha." And then the whole Nazi crowd erupts in laughter, and he's able to get the 2 out of there.
Wow. So it's like reality as artifice.
Exactly.
Like they're scared because they're Jews, so we'll just call attention to the fact that they're Jews as if it's a joke.
Right. Oh, like, look at those Jews. They're so scared. Ha ha ha, they should be. And then the act continues. And it was so funny because I was watching the movie mostly kind of bored, mostly like, oh gosh, that moment was better. That moment's better. Brooks, I love you. Why is this not so good? And then that moment happened. And I think I said to Mom, that was good. That had perspective. And it also shows what you can do with comedy when you are allowed to name the thing that is at stake, because that moment is funny because it is so heavy. It's sort of similar to in Cabaret at the end of If You Could See Her Through My Eyes, when he's been dancing with a gorilla. You think that all these excuses he's making for her are because she's a gorilla. And then Joel Grey, as the MC, immortally whispers, "If you could see her through my eyes, she wouldn't look Jewish at all," which is just a blockbuster of a moment.
There are also moments of like the thing you're scared of being revealed. If you reveal it as a joke, you can kind of get your power back in the situation. I'm trying to think of like a really good example from this movie, but maybe something in like the fakeness of the beard. You know, when he's scared that they'll find out his beard is fake. Oh, the thing to do is put the fake beard on the real Seletsky. And then ultimately, like, you know, Rawitch's idea is to just reveal that his beard is fake. And that's how he's going to get him out of there. So it's almost like artifice, real artifice. Too many layers.
I noticed that you two also put in your notes Inglourious Basterds and Jojo Rabbit. And I'm curious as to both your thoughts on that, because they've both been compared to Be or Not to Be. One, I think Inglourious Basterds for obvious, Tarantino stole the ending and then, you know, used it for his own purposes. And then Jojo Rabbit in a more generalized way. I'm curious as to both your thoughts on how those films kind of either build off in maybe constructive ways or maybe not ways from this film.
As you said, they're very clearly descendants of this film. When I think about even just the repetition of Heil Hitler for comedy, that's something that Jojo Rabbit took very literally from this film. For as much as Heil Hitler is used comedically in so many different ways in To Be or Not to Be, there are some moments where it still sends a chill down my spine. Even the moment when Carol Lombard says it after the kiss, there's something that's still upsetting about seeing someone you love so much saying that. Even honestly, earlier in this conversation, Gary, when you said it, I got a little twitch. So Jojo Rabbit, I think, playing with the comedic tone of, you and I talked about this in the last podcast about how my professor introduced this film to a comedy class by saying, "How funny is Hitler?" And then when no one wanted to answer, she said, this isn't a trick question. Hitler isn't funny. Now let me show you a movie where Hitler's funny. And I think that is like, one of the theses of Taika Waititi's Jojo Rabbit. And then with Inglourious Bastards, again, it's about the power of cinema to redefine real events, which is obviously like a whole kick that Tarantino is on, like he can kill Hitler. He can free an enslaved person and make him the action hero. He can prevent the Manson murderers, all with the power of cinema. It was almost like it wasn't earned in a way, or it's almost too painful to think about just how easy it is for you to kill Hitler when so many people died wanting to do just that. But Gary, you had a good reframe for me, didn't you?
Yeah. So when we were talking about this the other day, I think the positive reframe is to turn it back to Lubitsch and look at how Lubitsch is someone who was literally targeted for hate by Hitler himself, whose face was used, I think, or at least threatened to be used on posters for the archetypal Jew, a man whose work in his earlier days was used by the Nazis to stir up anti-Semitic discourse. And of course, if you want more on that, the Shusalam Pinkas episode is excellent. We're talking all about the potential complications of that character. And Lubitsch making this movie in which he uses the power of theater and cinema to defy the Nazis, to escape them, not to kill, because that's a bridge that's pretty far. I think your point is that he's earned it. Like, he is the anti-Hitler, and he has had his work used against him, had his own face used against him and his people. And as you all articulated so well in the Shusalam Pinkas episode, he was not a religious Jew. He was assimilated. This is a man who was not even sort of the most extreme version of what a Jew could be, except, I suppose, in his accent or affect or look. But this was really personal for him in a way that I think you want it to be more personal for Tarantino, where Tarantino seems to be his connection and is his love of the movies, which is great. Like, he literally uses nitrate to blow up the theater. That's fantastic. Tarantino loves cinema. Yeah. But it's worth saying that Taika Waititi is not only a Jew playing Hitler, but also a person of color. So in the many ways that the conversation about the position of the Jews in that time can be extended imperfectly, but can be extended to the situation of people of color now, particularly in Waititi's native New Zealand. That gives, I think, Waititi a little bit more sort of credibility to make this movie that laughs in Hitler's face and, like Lubitsch does here, shows many of the Nazis to be kinda extreme, goofy humans with clownish aspects.
I think one thing that about Inglourious Bastards ending that I always found interesting, it's been a few years since I watched it, so I might have to eat my words when I rewatch it. I always found it interesting how the film kind of turns from being a film that, at least in the last 20 minutes or so of the film, both times I watched it, I got a real sense that the film was kind of almost turning into a response to itself. It goes from a revenge fantasy to kind of what Tarantino's kind of been doing for the past 20 years, is an anti-revenge fantasy, where at the end it kind of goes, well, you got your wish. That wasn't so great, was it?
You know how Mark Wahlberg was supposed to be on one of the planes on 9/11, and he famously said, if I had been on one of those planes, 9/11 wouldn't have happened because I would have stopped it. And he was rightfully taken to task for saying that. And I feel like that's how I feel in all of these movies where Tarantino's like, well, I can stop the Manson murders. I can free the enslaved. I can kill Hitler. And I'm being really hypocritical here because the power of cinema to do all of those things is exactly what I'm obsessed with. And maybe there's power in the discomfort that I feel. Maybe that is part of what makes these films interesting. But for whatever reason, I guess it's too visceral for me. Personally.
For what it's worth, I think Inglourious Bastards is his best movie, and it's terrific. And I was deeply shaken by it. But then I saw a lot of kind of commentaries. How should we feel about this movie? How should Jews respond to this? And I want to give Tarantino the benefit of the doubt that that response, that truly ambiguous response, is what he was looking for. I don't know if that quite extends to the next two films in his reimagined historical fantasies, but for that one, it's particularly effective for me. It reminds me of, Devin, what you were saying about how should we feel about this. It reminds me of the end of Kill Bill, where she's accomplished what she's set out to, and her face is very complex. She's smiling, she's crying, then it turns into joy. But I think Tarantino in particular has this very deep interest in, does revenge feel as good as you want it to? But I think there's something to be said for Lubitsch stopping short of revenge and keeping it to escape, which feels almost more powerful to us, especially given that Greenberg does not escape. And Dara and I have been looking for clues in the movie as to what do we think his fate is. We know that he's dragged away by two people whose names Tura knows, so presumably they're company members. We do know that he's going to be in Poland as a Jew throughout the Holocaust. That ends badly, spoilers. But then we get this optimistic line about how he's going to play Shylock again on a stage in Poland. And it's this beautiful idea of what real, I think, survival looks like. Maybe that's what we're talking about here. We're not just talking about, like, revenge ends. Survival continues. Survival goes on. And we don't know what happens to Greenberg. Maybe he does survive the ghettos of Warsaw. Maybe he does survive Auschwitz. Maybe he comes out of this and he does get to play Shylock on the stages of Poland once again. Why not? We get to make that decision. That script isn't written. And I'm actually getting a little emotional, like, saying this out loud, because so many people didn't.
I think that's really beautiful what you said about revenge versus survival. In terms of Greenberg's kind of ambiguous fate, that line about he'll play Shylock again, it could be optimistic, but it could also be just referencing the gravity of the fact that they had to leave Greenberg behind. I mean, when you cut to the inside of the car with Jack Benny and Brodsky, it's the first thing Brodsky says. He reminds us, he brings up Greenberg. So I think they're acknowledging the ambiguity of his fate. And the way he says he'll play Shylock again could also be seen as symbolic wistfulness. Is it optimistic? I think even that is very, very ambiguous. But the point is to bring it back to Greenberg.
We talk about dramatic irony a lot within works, right? The diegetic dramatic irony of a work, what one character knows and doesn't. But I also think one thing we can grapple with here is the irony between what we know and what everyone involved in this could never have known, right? This was made in late 1941-42, and I used to teach this film in a class that was not about history, it was just about film aesthetics, but I gratuitously included this. So I'm going to refer to these old notes I have because I think they're very carefully worded to get at this. To Be or Not to Be was made at kind of a very specific moment for especially the Jews of Poland, where the Wannsee Conference occurred a month before its release during the film's post-production. Auschwitz II-Birkenau was being built as this film was being produced. Operation Reinhardt wouldn't begin until March 1942, which is 1 month after this film was made. It was between this film's release and 1945 when 2 million of Poland's 3 million Jews were murdered, and 90% of Warsaw was obliterated after this film was made. And so the question of, okay, how does that align, like Greenberg will be playing again in the stage of the Polish theater? How would that sound to someone in late 1941? And how does that sound to us now? There's an unbridgeable gap there between what we know, because the events that occurred after this are so indelibly present for us in a way that they could not existentially have been for Lubitsch and company. So to me, that's part of what makes this film, in my opinion, one of the most valuable documents in cinema history. It's an incredibly sincere and funny and heartbreaking, plea for humanity in the middle of one of the worst human calamities in history. I often get asked, Devin, why the hell do you show old movies in film class? Why should we watch old cinema? It's dated. To me, that's never the right angle of looking at it. It's, okay, this film could only have been made the moment it was made. Not a month later, literally, not a month later. This film could not have been made, not a month earlier. That's why it's special. That doesn't date it. That makes it unrepeatable. Mel Brooks couldn't do it with all of his great skills. Tarantino can't do it. No one can repeat this movie because no one here has a time machine to go back to late 1941. And to me, that's what makes it so special.
He is conveying a very real message. He's doing it in a package that I think is so easy to consume, although obviously audiences at the time couldn't be the case for them. It was too real. There are a lot of examples of movies that kind of sneak really important messages into packaging that's easy to consume, kind of like how you trick your dog into taking his pill. And to me, I think there is an aspect of that. There is such an incredibly, very real, very dire, sincere heart to this film, but it's in this package that's comedy, or is it? This goes back to the quote of he didn't want anyone to be relieved from anything. They are completely part and parcel. And yet, if I just want to relax and watch a movie, am I going to watch this or am I going to watch Schindler's List? I'm going to watch this every time. Obviously, that is saying nothing about the quality of Schindler's List, but I don't like to live in that world when I go to watch a movie. It's very seldom that I will watch a more straightforward World War II or Holocaust film. but this film I could watch any night of the week. It doesn't make the message any less real. Everything in this movie, it's like it's not in spite of each other, it's because of each other. Gary was talking before about how you go back and forth from a thriller to a sex comedy. And of course, Lubitsch is famous for his sex comedies. He's famous for his very flippant thruples or adulterous love triangles. And something that struck me so much the most recent time I watched this movie was that at the very beginning, when Robert Stack thinks that this is the moment that Carole Lombard is going to leave her husband and he can take her away to her farm. And by the way, Robert Stack, like he's not your typical Lubitsch character. He's especially not your typical Lubitsch character who would be involved in a love triangle where you can still be comfortable about everyone.
He's guileless.
Yes. He's just a bit more wholesome. Even though he's playing Pole, he's got this real all-American quality about him, which again is, I'm sure, very on purpose in terms of blurring those lines. So there's this moment he's saying, of course you're going to leave your husband for me. And she's thinking, oh no, how do I get out of this? And you're thinking, oh no, how does she get out of this? And then what's the Saved by the Bell? War.
Without any declaration of war, German troops crossed our border at several points this evening.
Without a word of warning.
They'll pay before they're through. We're going to fight them.
War. It's really war. People are going to kill each other and be killed.
And suddenly, that problem that we were just, oh no, how does she get out of? War gets her out of it. And yet it also, I think in some ways, allows for the comfort of this love triangle because she's immediately sincere when she says,
Stanislav, come back.
I have to.
Because he's about to go actually fight this war. It gets her out of this love triangle moment. It also solidifies a very sincere, I don't even think I'd call it love or affection, but, almost all of Lubitsch's love triangles, there's sincerity among all the corners of the love triangle. And war is what allows for this. It also gets her out of the of when Jack Benny finds Robert Stack in his bed. Yes, of course, you have these constant references to the fact that he's angry.
It's unbelievable. I come home to find a man in the same boat with me, and my wife says to me, what does it matter?
And yet she gets to say, well, I hope your country comes first. We've got this war to fight. We've got to fight Hitler.
Don't you realize Poland's at stake?
Have you no patriotism? Now listen, you. First you walk out of my soliloquy, and then you walk into my slippers. And now you question my patriotism.
The war, again, will get her out of the most crucial point of the love triangle. And it manages to keep it so light that at the end of the movie, the final note is that she's just going to continue doing this.
So I was going to point out how the sex farce is not done. We're not out of it. In fact, it's going to continue being an important plot thread. And most of the ways that Joseph Tura gets into trouble aren't for saying the wrong thing as a Nazi. It's for saying the wrong thing as a jealous husband is how he more often than not gets himself into trouble. So the sex farce will have literal repercussions on the Nazi thriller angle here. And then there's that line where Robert Stack says, we're in the same boat. And I think by the end, when you get to that hilarious moment, they're safe in England. Joseph Tura is about to do his Hamlet again. And he makes eye contact with Robert Stack. Robert Stack is watching eagerly. The soliloquy begins and up goes someone else. And now they're both kind of being cheated on. If we can assume like a Lubitchian throuple has been established here, then who's that guy? This is just going to keep going, and maybe they'll keep adding more and more gentlemen to this boat for them all to comfortably be wearing each other's slippers.
Yeah, and Devin, it goes back to what you said about at the end of the movie, no one has changed. There's no character arc, except maybe for Greenberg. And Gary, you pointed out earlier that while Jack Benny's acting as he's playing these various characters, he does have slip-ups, usually because his jealousy as a husband is coming through. But Carole Lombard, Maria Tura, nails it every time. Mm-hmm. Her performance is flawless. Her improvisations are flawless, with all the jokes about who's the better actor. Also, even in her adultery, her acting is flawless. It's a fun underpinning to the kind of competition between these two characters.
I mean, think about those lines, those immortal Lubitchian lines.
Shall we drink to a blitzkrieg?
I prefer a slow encirclement.
I mean, it's just genius comedy about making light of this deep, dark situation that also underlines just how much danger she's in. But her line, the slow encirclement, you could read as what she's doing to Seletsky, because she's got a plan and she's executing that plan, which includes potentially having to kill him as necessary. There's that, the suicide letter that she fakes for him. While he's trying to blitzkrieg her, she's slowly encircling him. And fundamentally, everything she's supposed to do works. And earlier today, Dara and I were laughing over the phone about how she's so good at yes and, including it up till the grand finale. This is a moment where I think even for as good as she is, her will is it's not her will, but her ability to influence her circumstances is starting to break when Sig Roman, who we've talked so little about, and he's so good, when he's coming in.
I can make life worth living for you. I can give you extra butter rations. I'll give you 3 eggs a week.
I don't want any eggs.
But it's dangerous. Like, she's not necessarily getting out of this. And then in walks Bronski as Hitler, and it looks like she was waiting for an assignation with Der Fuhrer himself. And she yes-ands it.
Why didn't you tell me?
Well, how could I? Don't you understand? Haven't you any tact? My Fuhrer! My Fuhrer!
And it's just the perfect topper on you'll be saying Heil Hitler before the night is out. She's a pro. She's the best actress in Poland. What can we say? And for Carol Lombard in particular, being attracted to the script because of its viciously anti-Nazi stance, it's so intrinsically funny and also bleak, but funny that this is the way that she leaves that scene.
But Gary, you also wanted to talk about the meaning of the title.
So in David Kalat's commentary, he suggests that the real meaning of to be or not to be is to be or not be in the sense of appearances deceiving, which is very true, particularly for Hamlet, which is a play all about appearances deceiving. But for me, I've always read to be or not to be the title directly from its source soliloquy, to be or not be on an existential level. That what is at stake in this movie is our continued survival as Poland, as the anti-fascist world, and as Jews in particular. So to be or not to be takes on this deep gravity of, are we going to keep going after this? Because if not, then we got to do what this wily Polish theater troupe has done, and we got to fight.
This has been everything I could have hoped for and more. So thank you so much. This movie is too rich of a text to even get through in one episode, much less 2, which is what I had planned. And I wish I could do a whole show about this one film because there's endless ways to approach it. And I think we've done a good job of at least broaching some incredibly important stuff. And you both have been such sweethearts with this. So thank you so much, both of you. This has been a lovely recording.
This is the most fun. This is exactly my favorite thing to do. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. You say, who would donate our time? Oh my God, I have to do it again. This is fantastic.
Next week, Peter Labuza joins us for further discussion of To Be or Not to Be. Head over to ernstcast.com for information as to where you might find the films we'll be discussing this season and other resources such as show notes and our Discord server. How Would Lubitsch Do It is a production of Moving Image Agency. Anna Citak-Scott was our recording engineer. Recording facilities provided by the Margaret Herrick Library in Beverly Hills. Griffin Sheel was our dialogue editor for this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on whatever podcast platform you happen to use. It helps other people find our podcast and therefore find Ernst Lubitsch. We'd like to acknowledge that this podcast was produced on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples.